afternoon, everybody. I am here with Corinne Grapier, the founder of Uplift Agency. You are remind me again.
A social change and sustainability
Social
agency.
change and sustainability agency. Listen,
Yes.
we are so grateful that you are here and so
Thank
happy
you.
that you're contributing to this cause and to this conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to you and have you kick this thing off and enjoy. Everybody, please.
All right, thank you. So hi, everybody. As he said, I am the CEO of the Uplift Agency. We are a social change and sustainability firm. I wasn't going to talk much about the agency, but then I realized that this is the Purpose Summit, and it is the fulfillment of my purpose, so I should talk about that. So I've worked in large corporations like Kellogg's and Allstate Insurance and Northwestern Mutual, and then I started consulting on my own to nonprofits and corporations, and started consulting to the United Nations and working in supporting nonprofit organizations in 25 countries that are experiencing crises or conflict. So I've kind of run the gamut in terms of social impact, and the agency is really my fulfillment of helping to close the gap between business and the people and the communities that business impacts and bring them closer together to find social and environmental solutions that benefit all of us. So we always say that business is changing the world. So whether that's for good or bad or something in between a lot of times, right, is up to the companies of today. So at Uplift, we uplift business to be its best for people and for planet, and so that profits and purpose advance together. So we believe that if you use a systems thinking perspective and smart strategies, you can advance both at the same time. This is a handsome group of people that we are. So we are communicators, we are strategists, we are social and environmental consultants that all work as a collective to support our clients. So on our agenda today is what is a conscious company? Why does it matter? How do conscious businesses act and operate differently? And then how can organizations get started? And I am totally comfortable with you interrupting me and asking questions as we go. So I have no problem with that. I think of this more as like a classroom environment than a presentation. All right, so what does a conscious company look like and what type of actions do they take or not take? So I'm gonna ask you guys in the audience to share your thoughts on that. I'm gonna give you 8 seconds to think about it because I used to teach at Western Michigan University. And I learned from teaching that you have to give people 8 seconds to really think about questions before they feel comfortable speaking up usually. So hopefully you've had about 8 seconds and would love to hear your thoughts on what does a conscious company look like and what type of actions do they take or not take? What do you think?
I believe a conscious company
Oh, we got a microphone.
I believe a conscious, by the way, my name's Dan.
Dan.
I believe a conscious company takes into account the needs of the society around it, and the actions they take or do not take would be basically anything that would negatively impact the society, the people that are part of the organization, the people that their customers. Basically, they're not looking to take advantage of them. Instead, they're looking to improve their lives and the lives of those around them.
I think that's a great explanation. So thought holder or stakeholder kind of centric, thinking about the people they impact. Anybody else want to share what type of actions they think companies take or don't take who are conscious companies? Anybody else? Okay. So you may have heard, it seems like forever ago, but it was September of 2019 that the Business Roundtable entered a declaration. And at first there was like 181 CEOs, I think eventually went up to around 200, said business should operate ethically and responsibly, and that the declaration said we no longer simply have an obligation to our shareholders, we believe we have an obligation to all stakeholders. So it felt very groundbreaking in some ways that all of these CEOs of some of the largest companies in America are stepping up to say this, right? It was met with some skepticism, right? Because there are times a lot of talking and not as much walking that happens in companies in terms of social responsibility. But it was pretty groundbreaking. And so when we look at stakeholders, they said, we realize that we have to balance the interests of our employees, our consumers, our suppliers, the people in our supply chain, the people that are impacted by our supply chain, our communities, and our environment. And really this idea of a conscious company came from John Mackey and Ray Soda. John was the founder of Whole Foods. And he wrote the book Conscious Capital. They both wrote the book Conscious Capitalism. And it really was around 4 guiding principles: that business must have a higher purpose. It must take a stakeholder orientation, right? So we were just talking about that, right? Employees, supply chain, consumers. It must have conscious leadership. Culture starts at the top, right? So if your CEO and your leaders don't get it, you can't expect to shift the mindset of your company and be more conscious. It's crucial that the CEO and the leadership team understand and embrace the principles of conscious companies. And then really drive a conscious culture. It starts at the top, but it's got to be driven throughout, right? It's a mindset shift that has to happen in business to look at whether you're the engineer on the floor you're the engineer, you're the manufacturing person, wherever you're at, you've got to take the mindset shift to think of the long-term and near-term implications of your business decisions. So why does this matter? So our world needs business to live up to its potential. And you can think of this, we always talk about it in terms of minimizing harm and maximizing good, right? So we can think about minimizing harm pretty easily, right? Think about the 2008 financial collapse. Think about the pharmaceutical companies who looked the other way when there were so many opioids going to small pharmacies. This isn't a laughing matter, but there were more opioids going to pharmacies than there were people in the town, right? That should have raised the alarm of some people, right? But you're making money, right? So there's a looking the other way. Think of the many food companies that use cocoa in their supply chain, right? And a lot of those food companies in America give millions of dollars out to nonprofits in America to help kids be healthy and safe and happy. But many of those same food companies haven't eradicated child labor in their supply chain in Africa. So you can see when the Business Roundtable Declaration came out, why people were excited but skeptical, because there's a lack of looking across a business and looking at the impacts that business has throughout its entirety, and looking at it as a system and how that system affects the larger system in the world. And then one of the biggest examples I always want to draw on right now is looking at the Uyghur population in China. And the Chinese government has imprisoned, I think, around 1 million Uyghurs for suspected terrorism, and they're in work camps. And they are making products, and some of those products go to other suppliers that go to other suppliers that end up in Europe or American manufacturers. So they're in our products, right? When's the last time that we heard of people being sent to work camps, right? How atrocious that was in World War II. So we have to be mindful of the fact that business can influence the world, and that it's not just where we're at here, but there's a chain and there's a responsibility all along. And if you don't look, you're not going to find it. I can't tell you how many businesses we work with at the agency who say, oh, we would never use child labor. Well, of course you wouldn't. And I wholly suspect that most CEOs would not tolerate that, right? But if you don't look, if you don't have policies, if you aren't auditing those systems, you're not going to find it. Why else it matters? Stakeholders are demanding it. People want to be part of something bigger than themselves, right? That's why we're at the Purpose Summit. And then business performs better. So we'll talk a little bit more about all of these. I wanted to share a video, though. So I told you about some of the harm that business can cause. It can do a lot of good too, right? And so when you take that same mindset and you think of your stakeholders and you look at it as a system, you can do so much good too. And that's why I founded the agency, because I saw tremendous potential if business looked at itself as a system and the impact it had on the world. So I actually met Jim. We had lunch. He's an amazing man. So I'm going to have you listen to his story, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about him. Oop. And I think I've got to start right here.
we'd get hundreds of stories. And I still every day get 3 or 4 or 5 emails from people who are desperate in desperate situations and want help. They don't speak English. Their credentials aren't recognized. They have no resume, no references. And they've moved to a completely different country with completely different culture. So as far as my making a difference on the people from Syria, it didn't happen at one specific time. It was sort of a buildup of crisis. And I didn't feel that government or people were doing things fast enough. Canada has a private sponsorship system, which allowed me to sponsor people. So that's why I got inspired to do it. My goal was originally to sponsor 50 families, and I changed that to inspire as many people as possible to do their part. Bringing in this many people has required the support of multiple groups. So it's actually been a large community project. As these people have integrated into the community, they've become part of the fabric, and they've actually drawn the community together. Some of them are blue collar that were working in a factory or farming, and they can do that here. But some of them are professionals. Many of them are starting over again in their 40s or 50s. One that does stand out is Ahmed and Rula, who started a sock store in Guelph. Ahmed and Rula in Syria had run a clothing store, so they had familiarity with how to run clothing stores. What he's opening here is much smaller, but you have to start from zero and rebuild. You've given people new hope, and they can build and rebuild a new life in Canada. So the most important thing I've learned from helping the refugees is the secret to happiness. Being grateful for what you have, not ungrateful for what you've lost or ungrateful for what other people have. And if we can gain the secret of happiness through this, it's positive for all.
Okay. So Jim's an amazing guy, right? And when we were having lunch, he said, you know, I was watching TV like everybody else, and I was seeing the images that were on, and I saw the children, you know, who were floating up on the shores of Europe because their country's being bombed. And what else do you have to do but to flee, right? You either stay in your home and you die, or you flee. And he was saying, when I'm 80 years old, I don't want to know that I could have done something to help during one of the worst humanitarian crises of our lifetime, and I didn't, right? And so he's a businessman. So he took a business lens to the problem, and he hired a director of housing and a director of jobs and a director of food, right? And he created the infrastructure to be able to bring over families. He pays for their first year of rent. Some of them he employs in his workforce, those that he those that he believes have an entrepreneurial spirit to them. He's given them loans to start their own businesses, right? And so he's empowering and uplifting people through his business lens, right? And he was telling me that some of the folks that work in his manufacturing facilities are so thankful for having this job that they'll take their goggles off or their gloves off because they say, Jim, I can work faster this way. And he says, no, put your goggles and your gloves back on. But they're so grateful and appreciative to him that they want to give back to the company, right? And so one of the things he says, which I love, is do what you can with what you have, right? Do what you can with what you have. And so you might say, well, Corinne, I cannot bring 30 refugee families over to America, right? And he's in Canada, it's a different system. But in America, we have nearly 500,000 kids that are in the foster care system, right? And those kids, a decent portion of them are teens, and about 25% of the teens who are in the foster care system age out, right? So I think about myself when I was 19 and think about yourselves when you were 19. If you aged out and you didn't have anywhere, right? About 25% of those teens become homeless. I needed my parents' old 20-year-old couch. I needed cups. I needed plates. I needed a used car to get myself to college. I needed a laptop, right? If you don't have those infrastructures, you don't have that support system. So while it might be hard for a lot of companies or small or large businesses or churches or organizations to say, we're going to support 30 families, Could you support one foster child that's aging out and give them a job, right? And your workplace be the support system for them to help them get on the path. So it's a mindset shift, right? That it's not just about writing a check to a nonprofit or volunteering, but it's thinking about how you do business and how in the ways that you do business, you can integrate these things. Stakeholders are demanding it too. So as we had talked about, we see the rise of employee activism, right? And you saw this a lot in Silicon Valley, but employees will walk out and are starting to increasingly leave the workforce and speak up and having walkout days when they believe their employees are not being socially or environmentally responsible or discriminating against their coworkers, right? Consumers and customers are expecting it. So the rise, for example, products that are marketed as green have increased by 50%. The sales have increased by 50% in the last 10 years. Customers want products that are better for them, that aren't toxic to the environment or their families, but they're also more likely to purchase your product. So if there are two products that are similar in quality, consumers will overwhelmingly choose the product with the company that they know does environmental and social good, right? And just think about that like logically, right? You're gonna give your money to some place that you feel is giving back to your community. Stakeholders are expecting it in supply chains. So we talked about some of the troubles with supply chains, but it's increasingly being regulated by the government as well. And so they're starting to get more and more involved in stopping shipments and things. Businesses are starting to have to, the supply chains, first of all, were disrupted with COVID. We all saw that, right? I think at one point, well, even now, wood's almost the same cost as steel right now, which is crazy. So supply chains are being disrupted, but they're also being disrupted because of regulations, because they're trying to tamp down on some of the labor violations that are happening. Environmental regulations are coming down from the administration that are both going to push companies to have to think about what's in their products, but as well as how they run their facilities, their transportation, how they can be more energy efficient. So there's a business benefit if companies are able to anticipate the regulations, make the changes, because there's also incentives that are coming down, right? The government's regulating it, as I said, and communities are expecting it, right? So more and more the cost of doing business to be in a community, people are expecting that you're just not employing people, but that you're giving more back to the community. Something about supply chain too I wanted to mention is even just, I think it was last week or early this week, Salesforce, which is a huge supplier, huge company, issued a statement that it is going to require all of its suppliers to meet the scientific targets for climate change, right? So that's huge. And if you're a supplier, you absolutely have to be thinking about this because the pressure has largely been on public companies, but even private companies, even B2B companies are feeling the pressure now because other companies are saying, we aren't going to work with you unless we see that you're making progress and being responsible in your supply chain, in the environment, and in society. And people want things that are bigger than ourselves, right? That's why we're here. If you think about the times in your work life where you have felt the most engaged, the most motivated, it was probably times when you were working as a team and when we were solving a challenge solving a big challenge and problem together, right? So we all want to be part of doing good. And then lastly, business performs better. So I had given you some examples. You can see how it mitigates risk, consumers' choice. It's coming down for suppliers, as I mentioned. It advances inclusion and diversity. So we saw that, right? With the Me Too movement, with the racial justice movement, companies were giving donations to nonprofits, and then consumers were saying, yes, but we don't see any diversity within your leadership ranks. How committed are you to this, right? There is this level of activism and reckoning that's going on. Interestingly enough, so companies that have high ESG ratings, environmental social governance ratings, have higher stock performance. So hopefully all of these things are motivating people to really think about this. So I'm going to go through this and then I'm going to pause for questions. So I'm going to give you 8 seconds, right, to think of your questions. So how conscious business acts differently. A lot of businesses kind of started here in the S, right? We're going to give grants out. We're going to do food drives. We're going to have our employees volunteer. But it was disconnected from business. They were like nice to do things. It was seen as a way to engage employees. And that's good. And all of that stuff should happen. But companies that started getting more into a conscious level start to move into 2 here, right? So we're looking at mitigating risk, right? How can, as a business, we mitigate risk and contribute to business success, right? This starts to get you into how you're operating, right? It's not just about reactive and going out in the community and volunteering, but it's how am I running my business and what is the impact that that has on the world, right? So it's building strategic nonprofit partnerships to address community problems and issues. It's cause marketing. It's volunteerism that's more tied to skills-based volunteerism, or again, meeting specific community needs. It's anticipating regulations, the environment, responsibility, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and telling your story. If you want to jump even further over, then you have what I'm calling is stage 3. You're always going to do some of 2, but you always are going to have to do 2, right? But in 3, you're also looking at purpose and profit and the combination of that, right? There's a lot of startups, if you think about it, that have a social purpose to them, right? And that's kind of the founding. Now you see these larger, older companies trying to be more purposeful, right? It's harder for them to shift because they're so big, but it's absolutely doable. And when they do, it can open up new lines of business, right? We see this with the automotive company. We're in Detroit, right? So a lot of automotive companies, initially their mission would have been something like, we want to make the most high quality cars and be great, create a great place to work, right? That might have been like an older mission. A newer purpose, a lot of them are shifting to thinking about how do they solve the problems of mobility, right? So it's a mindset shift to a problem in the world, and how do they do that? So you see Ford creating scooters now, right? Because mobility is bigger than just cars, right? And people in cities get around different ways. So it's a mindset, it starts to become a mindset shift. A great example of that is Interface. So Interface's mission is to become the world's first environmentally sustainable and restorative company. I'm going to play a video of their CEO talking about this aha moment. He calls it a spear in the chest. I call them aha moments, where he realized the impact his business had and he shifted his mindset to be more conscious of it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways that they did this through product.
In 1994, all of that's in hand. It's working. The business is booming, and I'm 60 years old. Now, what does one do in that situation? Where does one's thoughts turn? To retirement and the seashore of the mountains, chasing a little white ball? None of that suited me. And we've begun to hear this question from customers that we'd never heard before. In so many words, what's your company doing for the environment? For which we had no answers. And it was very embarrassing. It was awkward for our salespeople. It was awkward for us, our manufacturing people, our research people, because we just didn't have anything we could say. So a group in our research division decided we ought to convene a task force and bring people from around the world to come together to assess our company's environmental position. What were we doing? Let's get us a list of things that we're doing. So they came to me and they said, yeah, let's we want to do this. I said, great, go for it. They said, well, we want you to launch this task force, to meet with them in their first meeting and launch them, give them a kickoff speech with your environmental vision. I didn't have an environmental vision. I didn't want to make that speech. They stayed on my case, and I finally said, okay, I'll be with you, I'll meet with you, and I'll launch your task force. But I did not know what I was going to say. I was really sweating. And at that moment, Paul Hawkins' book landed on my desk, and sort of like the rest is history. I was not an environmentalist. I had never given a thought to what we were taking from the earth, doing to the earth to make our products, except to always be sure there's enough of that stuff coming through the pipeline to keep our factories running, but not a thought. I was attuned to my customers. And when I found a subject that they were interested in, I got interested. But when I found Hawkins' book, it was a spear in the chest experience. And I read it and wept because it just laid out, so clearly the problems of the industrial system, the system of which, you know, my company, my creation, this third child of mine was an integral part. And I made that speech to that tiny little task force and using Hawkins material and challenged them to lead our company to sustainability. I know personally that I continue to speak, not just that first speech to that little group, but gathering of interface people, plant meetings, sales meetings, and I liken it to a pebble dropped in a pond. You know, there's a ripple that goes from that eventually dies on a distant shore. But the continual speaking that I did continued to pour energy into the ripple so that the ripple grew instead of diminishing. So from my point of view, that was my role, you know, to continue to articulate the vision over and over and over, even when people thought I'd gone around the bend.
So before we go to the next slide, what stood out to you about what he said? What struck you about his story and his process?
Because a question that I wrote down that I'd like your opinion on is what struck me about what he said is he was not attuned to the environmental impact of his company, but he's certainly attuned to his customers. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because it seems like unless you are predisposed to have this passion for whatever the cause might be, I can't think of another more meaningful way to get someone's attention than through customer pressure or a supplier. I mean, all those things you laid out is good, but I guess what is in your opinion, the biggest delta between people who care about social impact, environmental impact, et cetera, and people who do not from a business perspective, unless it's just customers? Yeah.
So one, I think it's a process, right? So people have to be aware that there's a problem and they have to understand it and they have to see how they or their business connects and aligns to it, right? So there is an education to it. He says later on in this, you can watch it on YouTube, the full thing, there's never an ex-environmentalist, right? Because once you learn and you educate yourself, you start to see it everywhere and you start to see the impact, right? And so I think a huge thing is raising the consciousness of leaders in business, right? And so, and I would even say to those business roundtable leaders, it was great they took that pledge. I bet you many of them still don't totally understand what they committed to. And there are innovative companies out there that are doing this work, but I think it really has to come to awareness, understanding, and then the pressure. I've found that CEOs really are motivated by risk and risk mitigation, right? So when you can align it to say, listen, your supply chain is getting regulated and you're not going to have access to these raw materials if you don't start to think about this, there's a risk to your business, right? Your employees are speaking up at town halls, you're getting questions, they're unhappy, right? There's a risk to your employee engagement. So yes, I think we can be positive and inform and educate, but there's also a heavy motivator in terms of laying out the risks to business to not do it. Any other things that struck anybody from this video? I'm going to tell you something really cool, or you might know, but I'm going to show you about what they did too. So they, you can remember that their mission is to become the world's first environmentally sustainable and restorative company. So they are looking at their environmental impact across their business, right? So across their facilities, their transportation, their manufacturing process, their products. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to. I missed that one. That's No, you didn't. I missed that. So they make flooring. So make carpets, tile, right? So they use a lot of petroleum in their products, right? And so they were looking at their minimizing their environmental impact, not only from their operations and offices and transport and manufacturing, but through their products, right? And so they started to look at how to make their products more recyclable, more sustainable. The United Nations Office of Food and Agriculture estimates that 640,000 tons of fishing nets are in the ocean right now, right? So what Interface did is they worked with a nonprofit to go into fishing communities, and they targeted families that were living in poverty. And they paid the families to go and collect the fishing nets because they're, floating in the ocean, being like garbage barges, right? So trash is getting stuck to them. Seals, dolphins are getting wrapped up in them, and then they're washing ashore, floating out in the ocean. So they paid families in high poverty communities and fishing communities to go out and collect the nets, right? So they're providing a livelihood now where there wasn't one. They then take, and they're working with a nonprofit to do that. They take the nets and they go to a processing facility where they break the nets down into yarn that then gets made into their carpet. So their carpet is now made from 81% recyclable material. This is a circular economy. This is a mindset, right? This is a system shift to say, look what's happening. First, they're helping restore the ocean, right? They're pulling something that's a pollutant to the ocean out. There's a social impact because they've thought about how can we use our company as a social good, and how can we address a social issue in this. And they're using it to make their products, right, more green, more sustainable, which we know consumers want. So it is a kind of lovely circle there, right, in terms of thinking through the way that they're doing. Now, they also say then, they go on to say, Ray goes on to say that in shifting this mindset, it led to cost savings. People are often surprised, but environmental assessments and programs and environmental work often saves business costs, right? Increased sales, consumer loyalty, their customers love it. He listened to his consumers, right? And a workforce that rallied behind the vision. So he goes on to say in that video too that he didn't force this upon anybody, right? So he spoke about the vision, and other employees educated themselves and got excited by his vision and learned, and it was a mindset that spread across the company, right? And so we remember, when you think back to those 4 principles, right? Conscious leadership, conscious culture, it's spread throughout the business. So let me stop there before we go to the next one. Any questions so far? I know I've put a lot out there. Because next we're going to talk about how you can start to do this in your own businesses or organizations. Okay. So how can you start? This is a chart we use in our agency when we're talking to clients, right? So what, we help them think about what are the environmental, social, health, and economic pressures on their business. And I think there's no better year than this year to realize, right, that health impacts everything, right? It impacts your business, it impacts your consumers, the economy impacts, right? So if you think of it as a funnel, these things put pressure on your employees, your customers, your communities. Those affect your business, right? It affects your purpose, your ability to achieve your long-term goals. But likewise, if you weave into your purpose being able to solve some of these social issues, you can't boil the whole ocean, right? But you've got to find the area, the space where you can make the change. And you build it into your long-term goals, right? You can help your stakeholders protect themselves from some of the environmental, social, health, and economic issues, and help improve those in the communities and areas where you're doing business, right? So this is trying to help you start thinking about the inflows and outflows that happen. Okay, so just as a thought starter, this is general manufacturer in the middle, right? Are any of you in manufacturing? Nope. Manufacturers have a lot going on right now, right? So many are doing philanthropy. There's new environmental regulations that are going to be coming down. They've got to rethink some of their product formulations and what that might entail, right? One thing I know, one of the manufacturers we work with is thinking about how it's going to change their products, right? Well, how do they have to reformulate their products, and what's that going to do to the price and the accessibility of customers to buy their products, right? And if customers can't buy their products, is there something they can do through their philanthropy to help work with nonprofits who can help provide access to these products that are needed? There's supply chain disruptions. There's product R&D, as we talked about. Consumers want green products, right? So how are you thinking about how that's playing out in your products? There's increased awareness that companies have to really be places that foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and to look at who's been left out. And there's labor workforce shortages, right? Now, when you think of it as a system, you can think about a lot of times manufacturers are in rural areas, right? Or they're in urban areas. They're not in necessarily the most livable communities usually. So how can an employer, by using their philanthropy and building partnerships with the community, create more livable communities? that are going to want to attract a workforce that can get and fill those labor shortages, right? So when you start to think of it as a system, and then you start to think about, well, who's going to be left out when our products have to cost more? From an equity standpoint, who's not going to be able to access our products? And how do we reach them, help them fill in that gap? So the systems thinking, it starts to get you, and you could add probably, 5 more bubbles out of here, right? But it starts to get you thinking about how one system affects another and how you can engineer those systems to help solve business problems, but solve community problems at the same time. This is a chart that we use as well with clients when we start to kind of hone in on where they should focus. What are the social and environmental issues that your company is uniquely qualified to help solve? What are the social and environmental issues that affect your company the most? And you look at where these things start to intertwine and weave. So I wanted to reinforce that one question, right, can start a movement. You think back to Interface. He had a consumer who said, what's your company doing to be socially responsible, right? So many of us might say, like, we're not the CEO, we're not the vice president, I'm an employee, I'm a manager, I'm a consumer, what in the world can I do? But your questions can start a movement. It started a whole shift of the Interface business, right? So speaking up from consumers, right, go out to social media is a powerful tool now, right? So going out on social media is something that everybody can do, but speaking up within your business, right? I really, truly do believe that if most leaders see the impacts that they're going to, and they understand how to take action, they're going to want to do it. And then think about your purchase power, both as a consumer, but business has purchase power too, right? Who they choose as suppliers, what they require of their suppliers can shift movements. And then lastly, I think imagine, right? So imagine Interface, and if every company took that same mindset, right? If every CEO had that spear in the chest and took that mindset, right? Imagine if they were all conscious companies, what problems we could solve in the world, right? While doing good for their business at the same time. So I've got a little bit of time now for Q&A if you guys want to dig into any of that more. And I can put this chart up because I think there's a lot in here.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much.
Sure.
That was very interesting stuff. The one question I had, it isn't necessarily with this chart, but maybe more to your specific purpose.
Yeah.
What brought you to doing this in the first place?
Yeah, so I started my career working in public relations. So I was responsible for a lot of talking and making companies look good, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But I also had a really big heart and passion for nonprofits and realized I could help companies use their resources to do good in the world, right? And so I started doing that, and I felt really good about myself, right? And I thought, I'm doing great for communities. I'm using the company's money and resources and employee volunteerism and channeling those. I had an aha moment, like the CEO of Interface. I had an aha moment when I started consulting to the UN, and I started working with grassroots communities in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Colombia, and I started to see kind of the other side, right? And a lot of times, sometimes the other side even of supply chains, right? Where raw materials are being mined and things like that, where our food's being grown and shipped over. And I just had this huge awakening that business could be such a force for good in those communities and around the world, but they had to start to understand their impacts that they had, and it couldn't be siloed, right? That diversity, equity, inclusion sits here, supply chain sits here, philanthropy sits here, right? But they're all interrelated, and we really have to approach it from that lens, and when they do, they have tremendous power to drive change.